Hello, welcome to my beautiful backyard in Berkeley, California. Wonderful end of January afternoon. Today I'm going to be discussing Psychology and Religion, the book by C.G.Jung. I just read it this morning and I found it to be a wonderful introduction to pretty much an overview of pretty much all of Jung's, or many of Jung's concepts that he developed. And so I'm going to try to, just in the next short little while here, go through this book and describe some of what he lays out in it. And I find this to be a pretty comprehensive account of his main ideas. So there's going to be a lot packed in here and a lot of really good stuff. So Jung obviously was he was a psychologist, but above all an empiricist. He really believed in working based on the results he was getting in his practice. And he was an active practitioner. He saw many people every day for his entire career. And so all of his work is based on conclusions that he got from real experiences that people had. And the first point that he makes in this book is that these experiences are real. The psychological experiences and things that come up in our mind, he treats them not as delusions or but really, if he's sitting down with a patient and they say, I think I'm stuck, I have a complex, I think that I have cancer, even though the patient doesn't, he treats that as a real thing. So he doesn't say that, okay, yes, like patient has cancer, but the idea that comes up in the patient's mind is real. And that's a very important concept for understanding Jung. And especially in how he differentiates from Freud. So let me just start with how Jung differentiates between the conscious and the unconscious. And so he originally was studying and working with Freud, and the way that Freud saw the unconscious was as a representative of our conscious life. And so if you, let's say through a dream, if you dreamed of a purple potato flying through the air, that could represent a time in your childhood when you saw yada 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 yada, and it has this certain meaning for you, but it's representative of something in your conscious life. And so the big difference here with Jung says that, well, that the unconscious is actually, it's not a representative of something. It's actually real. It's an originator, and he thinks of the unconscious as of kind of like an ocean, and the conscious self is like a tiny little island on that ocean. And so he is really an explorer of the ocean, and he says that it's that things really come out of and through the unconscious into the conscious self. And yes, there's different repressions that go on, and I'll get into that further on, but it's really, the idea is that it's a creator. It brings things about. And so in that vein, what he would say is that complexes, like neuroses that come up, aren't necessarily repressions of sexual desire for a mother figure, like Freud would say, or but they're actually something that come out of the unconscious originally. And so a common criticism of this would be of the conscious unconscious divide, and Jung's take on it would be, well, isn't the unconscious and the conscious both part of the same mind? So isn't it just it's just one thing? How could things kind of originate out of it? That would just be originating out of itself, and it's just a self loop that could keep going around and around. But what he says is that, well, no, it's actually not that easy, because what is a self? A self is not just our psyches are not just we're not just living in secluded bubbles, but we're actually interacting with the world and affected by the world around us. And so our psyches are actually composed of more than just an isolated individual mind. And so he develops this into his concept of the collective unconscious. And this is one of his most well-known theories and concepts. And it's really about what he's saying is that society shares these conditions, forms, and he develops the archetype, right? We all, and this lives through society as a whole, and through, and it just manifests itself in individuals. And so there's an original quality, and it shows up differently in individuals, but it links back to that same original quality or archetype that's living through us. And so that's one of his big claims, and he develops a lot based off of that. So one of the things that he talks about here is that if we just lived, let's say we lived in this world of a collective unconscious where things are just living through us, through the unconscious, from archetypes. If we just lived in that world and we didn't have our conscious selves, well, we would kind of just be a pile of a heap of emotions and interconnectedness, and we wouldn't really be anything or able to function. And so he kind of traces the development from a completely connected unconscious, where from what he calls primitive societies, right, where people just projected meaning onto the world, and where everything had meaning. And how I like to kind of equate this with Tim Morton's, his concept of inner space, right, and the whole movement in object-oriented ontology that's going on right now, which is where we're kind of re-granting inner space to everything in the world. And as we kind of developed, we then put this into a God figure. We said, okay, let's rein in a little bit. We're not going to assign meaning to everything in the universe, but there's this one God figure, and then and we're kind of, this is the steps of objectifying the world, essentially. And eventually we get to the point where we rein in meaning and enough where we declare the death of God, right? And through the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, Enlightenment, we even objectify our own brain, and we become disconnected from the accessing the collective unconscious forces kind of intentionally. And what he says is that this is really a huge issue in his time, and now in our time, I would say as well, where we've lost the ability to we've lost meaning in the world, and our ability to connect to the numinous, the unconscious, the beautiful and irrational. And so he was making this argument for that this was really a big cause of suffering in the world. This disconnection from the unconscious forces. So I'll just introduce two more terms here that I want to distinguish between, and it's between repression and suppression. And so repression he calls the things that we kind of doubt, that are a little bit awkward, that are unconventional, that we don't really from our ourselves, that we don't really want, that we don't acknowledge in our life, and that we repress. And it's important to note that unlike Freud, where we are these conscious selves and we repress this thing, we create repression that is represented and stored beneath, that we need to bring up. These repressions are really repressions of things that are naturally originating in our unconscious already. And so that's repression. Suppression, on the other hand, are things that he calls, it's kind of an element of our mind that he calls the statistical criminal. It's the really anti-social suppressions that that are just not okay, like, I don't know, pedophilia or whatever, not cool. And those things, when we suppress them, they don't necessarily lead to big problems. They're just, we more easily write off the suppressed events that are just not socially acceptable. But when we repress, when we have repression of things that are naturally, of the archetypes or things that are naturally happening within us, within our psyche, that are coming through the collective psyche, then two things can happen. We essentially create neuroses, and we create a shadow, right? And so I'll just go over, these are also both, shadow is a big term for Jung as well, but I'll just go over neuroses first. And so when we repress naturally occurring, let's say it's this book is on psychology and religion, so he's talking about it in the way of spiritual repression, or the connection to the divine or to nature, or to, let's say we repress or just the unconscious in general. Let's say we repress those urges. They can lead to mental problems that he was seeing in his patients every day, that cause that were kind of excuse me, that he sees as a substitute for suffering. So we have this where we're not connecting with the divine, let's say, is what he's saying. So we create a mental state that replaces that suffering. And what he says here is that we can he gives the example of that in society we forgive unconscious crimes, right? Like, for a large part, some we don't, but we might say, oh, whoops, like, I didn't know about that. And generally in our society, we will forgive someone for that. But what he says is that nature doesn't forgive. The psyche doesn't forgive. And if we kind of create a psychological crime against ourselves, we're going to punish ourselves in a certain way. So I'll go over shadow now. So the other, I guess, element of the unconscious that's created. It's a part of the unconscious, but it's a side effect of living life, and is the shadow, and we all have shadows. It's kind of the childish or irrational. He calls them awkward. Also, effects whenever of our conscious decisions. And so, for example, and this can happen at a personal level. We all have personal shadows, just unintended consequences, unconscious consequences of what we're doing. And then there's also societal shadows. So a famous example would be the Nazi regime or something like that, where they're promoting a certain ideology and they're just 100% focused on that, and there's this shadow that comes along with it, obviously, an unconscious shadow. And what he's saying is that the less that we embody the shadow in our conscious life, the denser and the blacker it gets. And so, if we take the Nazi example again, clearly, it seems like they were so caught up on this conscious push, ideological push, and they were ignoring their unconscious shadow to the point where it became pretty dense and black. And so these are the two kind of elements of the unconscious, the things that are created or through the unconscious, the neuroses and the shadow, that are consequences of repressing the unconscious. And one more note that he talks about here is that what's really interesting about shadows is that we tend to see each other's shadows and not our own. And so, I mean, this can lead to just war in general, right? Or even between individuals, where we become afraid of someone else's shadow. We become afraid of the shadow of the Republican Party, and so we take certain action against it. But it's really what he's saying is a symptom of a disconnection with our own shadows, and then what we really need to do is to acknowledge our own shadows and reconnect. And through that, they become less dark. So um, how do we do this? How do we connect with our our shadows? How do we connect with our unconscious? How do we alleviate our suffering? How do we avoid these consequences? And is a question that he asks. And his answer he gives is he does it mostly through dreams. And the first thing he says about dreams is that we are really, he was working at a while ago when it wasn't as accepted to work with dreams, but even in our society today, it is really kind of seen, people are afraid to work with dreams. People are afraid to jump to work with the unconscious. People are afraid to address their own shadow. People are afraid to go to therapy. Because I think the common uh, kind of conception of that is that, okay, well, if you start to do that, you're really opening a can of worms here that you're going to have to deal with. And it's going to start all kinds of problems. And I mean, obviously, his answer to that would be, well, all of these problems in the world are created because we're not doing that. So regarding, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about dreams then, and his dream work is really amazing because he saw over 60,000 uh, patients. He interpreted over 60,000 dreams in his lifetime, and so I was trying to kind of wrap my brain around that, and if he's practicing for 30 years, that would be about 2,000 dream interpretations a year or 6 a day, right? For 30 years straight. So he bases all of his analysis on just empirical, this is what happened. This was what people's experiences were over 60,000 dreams. And so there's a lot of that it gives a lot of credibility to his method. However, I it doesn't seem like there are, 100 other people who have also studied 60,000 dreams, and so there's not, when he pulls patterns out of these dreams, there's not necessarily other data sets that are this large to compare to. So you kind of have to take his interpretation and his word for some of these things, although they're based on a lot of detailed analysis and experience. So again, here compared to Freud, the difference is probably obvious. It's the same as the unconscious. Freud really looked at dreams as representations of the conscious self and the repressions from conscious life. And Jung, on the other hand, takes dreams at face value, right? So if Freud sees, I gave an example earlier, but if Freud interprets a dream where there's a kangaroo that's chasing you and throughout the night and it's really scary, you might say, oh well, that's a representation of time in of a father figure, of your father figure. Whereas Jung would say, actually no, that is really a kangaroo. So he takes dreams at face value because he sees them as ways to, as an intelligent voice of the unconscious, right? When we shut off the conscious consciousness, we can tap into the bigger sea of reality, which is the unconscious, and that expresses itself through dreams, and it's therefore he takes it at face value. And so one of the things that um, uh, help him is in this is that he sees this authoritative voice come through um, across many, many dreams that kind of speaks the truth of the unconscious. And maybe you've just heard this in your dreams, but it's a voice that would say, don't take a left here. You have to keep doing this or whatever. And it's kind of like a voice you can't disagree with. And so he calls that an authoritative voice, and he sees that happening across dreams, and he assigns that to uh, the intelligence that is being spoken out of the unconscious. And the other important thing is that just like the um, collective unconscious uh, connects us back to original archetypes, these archetypes are also expressed collectively through dreams. And so as he was analyzing these thousands and thousands of dreams, what he saw was that similar things were similar themes were coming up over and over. Oh, he wouldn't even call them themes because those would be representative. Specific symbols and archetypes were coming up were in across people of all different types of people. And what he concluded was that not only was that collective material that happens in dreams, these dream symbols, dream archetypes, are actually, they're passed down not just traditionally from culture, but actually also hereditary, in a hereditary way. And he attributed to this to seeing symbols from appear in people's dreams from all different types of people that were completely disconnected, and symbols that are no longer relevant in our society, that no one would ever have heard of, that were coming up, hundreds of years ago or thousands. He compares it to hundreds of years ago. So he makes this claim that the symbols, the archetypes, are also passed down in a hereditary way. Pretty interesting. So the thing that he finds coming up through dreams that he finds to be most relevant is the symbol. And so in all of his analysis of dreams, he really brought this out as something that he thought was really important to bring into conscious life. And the symbol in the form of, there were numerical symbols, there was also, but mostly what he's talking about is religious or dogmatic or ritualistic symbols, mandalas. He was really, he saw coming up in people's dreams everywhere. So he wrote a lot about mandalas and the symbol. And so I'll just talk for a minute about the symbol. And what's important for him with the symbol is that he says we are fragmentary in our condition right now. As humans, we are fragmented, and we can't actually connect in the way we are right now directly with the numinous or the divine or whatever it is, or maybe some of us can, but it's not, for him, he says it's not actually that important, um, because we can actually use symbols as a substitute to get to connect with that place. And in that way, we don't have to um, avoid total meltdown of our everyday lives, but we can attribute value to the symbol, and we can still and we can use that, or to religion, and we can use that to get over our to combat our fight essentially with the unconscious, to create neuroses and conditions that create suffering in the world and in ourselves. And so for him, actually, this book deals with psychology and religion, and so he talks about religion here as a really good way to deal with a loss of meaning in the world, even if we don't connect with that meaning. He says it's almost um, it's almost irrelevant, because we can use it as a defense against our black shadows and our neuroses. And he says that an irrational symbol, something like going to Catholic mass or whatever it is that connects us with a dogmatic or a ritualistic symbol, he says that's way better for um, for dealing with avoiding for avoiding these neurotic conditions of modern society, than rational, scientific, abstract explanations of things. And he says that that's because these irrational symbols can just far better represent the irrationality of our unconscious than a scientific explanation that tries to give us meaning or to our lives. So we can't know the truth, is what he says. We can't know the truth, and so if religion, if ritual, if mandala, if symbol can make us happy, if it can connect us with the unconscious, that is real. It's a real experience, and it is good, and it can it's a really important part of society and of our lives. So that was a brief overview of what this book is about, and obviously a lot more can be said about each one of these points, and which will be. Hey, what's up?